Hi guys, welcome back to another one of my representation. So today I'm going to talk about the decision making process, and let's jump right into it. First, we have to know what is the decision making process. So according to Eisenhower, he said that decision making is a process of making a choice from a number of alternatives to achieve a desired result. So decision making involves making a choice from a number of options, and the choice must be evaluated carefully and reasonably. For that, people have to know have to know how this decision was made, and all the processes above are done in order to reach a target, and it have to be feasible. Now we move on to the 6 steps in the decision-making process, and the very first step of that process is identifying the problem. So in this stage, you have to know what is the problem and the reason for its appearance. These steps require surveillance of the external and internal environment. These surveys are then analyzed by other people with numerous perspectives of the situation to identify where the problem may arise from, and this also helps the decision makers to have a deeper understanding of the overall situation. The second step in the decision-making process is generating alternatives. So in this stage, people will come up with a wide range of diverse alternatives to a problem, which involve a lot of discussions. As a result, they will have many different views and solutions. Therefore, they can prepare for the next step, which is evaluating alternatives. And this step involves even more discussions than the previous step. So people will see if the solution is feasible or not, and they will ask themselves questions like, is it worth the effort, or if there are any consequences, is it acceptable and worth it? So this step will eliminate the unsuitable choices and leave the best choices for the selection process. The next step in the decision-making process is choosing the alternatives. So after evaluating all the alternatives, the decision makers will have to choose the most reasonable solution to implement the decision, which is the next step. So this basically means that they would have to execute the alternative that have been planned before, and this is a very important step because the execution of an alternative will affect the outcome directly, which leads us to the last step in the decision-making process, which is evaluating the decision effectiveness. So after executing the alternative, people will have to look back on what they have done and see if the outcome is desirable or not, and they will have to come up with a benchmark to measure the satisfaction of the outcome. So they could learn from the experiences of the process, and they might have to choose another alternative for the problem if the execution process was poor. Now let's look at the factors affecting the decision-making process of a company. First, let's look at the internal factors, and the first internal factors is the company's policies. They set boundaries, constraints, and limit on the kind of actions that can be taken. The second internal factors is resources. And the resources can be divided into 3 different categories. First is the finance. This is a limitation to a decision maker because they might come up with excellent solution, but the limited amount of money might not allow them to implement the decision. Secondly is this human resource. This depends on the intelligence of the decision makers and the consensus of the employees when decision is made. Last is technology. This is very important, especially in this age when technology is changing in a very fast pace. This factor might restrict the decision-making process if the company are lack of equipment. Now let's look at the external factors. The first external factors is the information inputs. This is an indispensable part in decision-making process. If the sources of the information are not precious, the whole decision-making process will be meaningless because in order to identify the problem, which is the very first step, companies need to find information about the problem to have a clear understanding of the situation. The next external factor is the economy. which is the overall situation of the business world. Firms need to stay up to date to know what have been going on and react to it or predict what might happen in the future. The decisions have to be made based on the current economic situation. So let's look at what factors the company should consider when HR decisions are being made. So we have resources as a representative of the internal factor. This factor gives the company a clear understanding of their abilities, strengths, and weaknesses, so they could avoid wishful thinking and they can come up with more practical solutions. Now let's look at the external factors. So the information inputs is the most important external factors. So the information inputs help the company to evaluate the threats and opportunities of the external environment so they can take full advantage of the opportunities and avoid the upcoming threats. So if you combine these two factors, it would make up a SWOT analysis. So the question here is how the process of making decisions helps the firm to improve over time. So the decision-making process is a complicated process which requires a lot of tasks to be done, and it helps the employees to enhance develop their interpersonal skills, such as teamwork. So employees have to work together to find out the solution to a specific problem. They have to work together to discuss a new idea, eliminate the unsuitable methods, etc. And they could also improve the individual skill, because the more a person does something, the better they are at that job. So the improvement of the employees in the company means that the inner strength of the company is developed. Next, the decision-making process itself is very beneficial. Through this process, the company can come up with the best decision to a problem. So if the decision is excellent, the company can achieve their goals. But if the decision is bad and the outcome is disappointed, the company can still learn from their mistakes and avoid making the same mistakes in the future. So the decision-making process is beneficial in either way. Now let's take a closer look at the decision-making process in WS Incorporation. And first, we will evaluate their strengths and weaknesses in the decision-making process. First, let's talk about the strengths. So the very first strength of WS Incorporation is that every people in the HR team are involved in every aspect of the decision-making process. Because there are not too many employees in WS Incorporation, and the relationship between the staffs is very solid. This makes every individual in the company feel that they are important and their ideas and opinions are respected. This will encourage them to come up with more creative ideas and speak out their opinions. The second strength is that they are very respectful when it comes to choosing the final alternatives, which could avoid internal conflicts after many exalted discussions when making decisions on the alternatives. And they are also excellent at quick decision making because they will come to a conclusion without struggling too much. Next is their weaknesses. So the first weakness of WS Incorporation is that they are struggling to identify the problem. And as I said in the first presentation, the weakness of WS Incorporation is that the employees are lack of adaptability and business acumen, which means that their employees don't have the capability to fully understand the overall situation. So they are still rambling when a problem occurs, especially when it comes to changes in the uncertain circumstances. And also their helps in the first step of the decision-making process are still little. The last weakness of WS Incorporation in decision-making process is that they still not cover up all the fields of HR when generating the alternatives. This is closely related to the lack of business acumen that I have mentioned, because the employees don't fully understand the problem, so they are not aware of the impacts it may have on the company and on HR in particular. So they might miss out on some important details when coming up with solutions. Now let's look at the strengths and weaknesses of WS Incorporation in relation to the most important factor that they consider, which is the recruiting process. So the strength that I have mentioned before which is the involvement of every employee in the decision-making process. So they can work together to find the right person that fit with them or fit with the employees, which in other words fit with the company's culture. So the recruitment process will be very strict and careful, which is exactly what the OS incorporation want. The next strength is the respectful attitude towards the final decision. So the employees know what is best for the company, so they can sacrifice some of the requirements that they want from the candidates. These include the planning and selection processes in the recruitment process. So the company can employ the best candidates that are available on the labor market, and this can create a solid strength compared to the other companies in the field. Now, let's say their weaknesses is the struggling in the first step of the decision-making process. So the reason for this is that the HR team might not recognize all the requirements that they need in a candidate. And this can also lead to the time consuming of the first step of the recruitment process, which is the planning process, because this involves the evaluation of the company's situation to understand the needs of the company in finding new employees. Their last weakness is the lack of fully acknowledging the impacts of the problem on the recruiting process. This is the cause to the slow update of the needs that the company expect from the candidates, and it could take a significant amount of time of the recruiting process. Now let's look at the expected impacts of the recruiting process on the firm's development. First, it will save DOS incorporation a lot of time because the employees are already fit with the culture of the company, so they don't have to take too much time to feel comfortable with the new environment. And it will also save time for the training process in the future. Next, DOS incorporation will have sufficient and good quality talents, which help the company to achieve their business objectives because the employees are the most important asset of DOS incorporation. Now let's look at DOS incorporation wants from the university students and their candidates. So what should university students focus on developing while they are at university? So according to Mrs. Hong, the first skill that they have to learn is the skill to skillfully use and apply their foreign language. So there are many students who have good English certificates such as IELTS but don't have the ability to use the language. The reason for this is that when they studied English, they learned how to get good marks for the certificate instead of learning how to really use the language. Next is the communication skill. So the student will have to know how to present and share their opinions, how to listen to others, and how to use communication tools such as chat, email, or letter, etc., to communicate with their colleagues and customers. This will save time for the new employees to cope up with the environment and create a strong bond among employees. Next, they have to attain a growth mindset. So the student will have to always ask questions and find the answer. And they will also have to learn continuously, and they have to open for new ideas and perceptions. Next is the skill to find, select, and research for information. This will help students to learn by themselves without little or no help from the others. They have to also learn to use basic documentation software such as Word, Excel, or PowerPoint. And for the main subjects that they are studying, they should also learn from many other sources, not only from the textbooks and the school. Now let's look at DOS incorporation's rank in order of importance of the four elements. So the most important thing to DOS incorporation is talent. Next is experience, grades, and relationships. So the reason why talent is above everything is that talent is the hardest thing to acquire for a candidate. To be specific, a candidate is born with talent while the experience can be obtained through time. And as I said earlier in my last presentation, the students' grades mean very little to DOS incorporation, but the relationships of the students to the company is ranked even lower than the grades. This is because who the candidates know don't show how good they are as a staff. and their relationships might come from many sources, including their parents. So it shows little about the candidate's skills, knowledges, and experiences. That is the end of my representation. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.